The first shovel broke ground on March 15, 1889, at 6:47 in the morning, when the temperature in the foothills east of Sacramento registered a mild 52 degrees Fahrenheit and the soil held just enough moisture from the winter rains to cut cleanly. By noon, Cornelius Vanderberg had removed approximately 340 cubic feet of earth from what would become the eastern perimeter of his property, and by sunset, 3 separate neighbors had ridden past his 160-acre claim to observe what he was doing. By the following Sunday, the congregation at the Coloma Methodist Church had a new topic of discussion that temporarily displaced even the ongoing debate about whether the railroad spur would reach their valley. The Dutchman, they said, was digging a moat. Not a well, not an irrigation ditch, not a root cellar, a moat, a continuous water-filled channel that he apparently intended to encircle his entire homestead, as if he were some medieval lord preparing for siege warfare against an army that existed only in his immigrant imagination. The laughter was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of people who had lived in these hills for 15 years or more and understood certain fundamental truths about California that this newcomer, despite his obvious industriousness, had apparently failed to grasp. Water was precious here. Water was for drinking, for livestock, for the vegetable garden that kept a family fed through winter. Water was not for filling decorative trenches around one's property like some kind of European affectation transplanted to the American West. Cornelius Vanderberg was 43 years old that spring, a widower who had arrived in California 18 months earlier with his 2 sons, a collection of hand tools that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, and a knowledge of water management that stretched back 4 centuries in his family's history. He had come from the province of Zeeland in the southwestern Netherlands, a region where the relationship between land and water was not a matter of convenience or aesthetics, but of existential survival. His ancestors had built and maintained the dikes that held back the North Sea. They had engineered the drainage systems that transformed marshland into farmland. They had learned, over generations of trial and catastrophic error, that water could be either your greatest enemy or your most reliable ally, depending entirely on whether you respected its power and planned accordingly. What Cornelius saw when he looked at the golden hills of El Dorado County was not the paradise that the land speculators advertised in their brochures back east. He saw a landscape of accumulated fuel, dry grass, dense chaparral, stands of pine and oak that had never been thinned, waiting for the inevitable spark. He saw a climate that delivered most of its annual rainfall in a 4-month window and then baked under relentless sun for the remaining 8. He saw the black scars on distant ridges where fires had swept through in previous years, and he saw the way the local settlers rebuilt in the exact same locations using the exact same methods, as if the next fire were an abstraction rather than a certainty. He saw all of this, and he began to dig. The dimensions Cornelius had calculated were precise, based on principles his grandfather had taught him during long afternoons maintaining the drainage channels outside their village of Westkapelle. The primary channel would be 8 feet wide at the top, sloping to 4 feet wide at the bottom, with a depth of 5 feet. This trapezoidal cross-section was not arbitrary. It maximized water volume while minimizing erosion of the banks, and it created a surface area sufficient for evaporative cooling of the surrounding air. The total perimeter of his property was approximately 2,640 feet, a half-mile of continuous excavation that would require the removal of roughly 29,000 cubic feet of earth, or slightly more than 1,070 cubic yards. Working alone, at his current pace of 340 cubic feet per day, the excavation would take approximately 85 working days, or about 4 months if he allowed for rest on Sundays and interruptions for other essential farm work. His sons, Henrik at 16 and Peter at 14, would help when they were not needed for other tasks, potentially reducing the timeline by a third. The first skeptic to voice his concerns directly was Robert Halloran, a 62-year-old rancher whose property bordered Cornelius's to the north. Halloran had been in the California foothills since 1862, having arrived during the tail end of the gold rush and transitioned to cattle ranching when the easy placer deposits played out. He had survived the drought of 1864, the floods of 1867, the grasshopper plague of 1874, and 3 separate wildfire seasons that had burned across his grazing land. He understood this country, and he felt an obligation to share that understanding with newcomers who clearly did not. Vanderberg, Halloran said, dismounting from his roan gelding and walking to the edge of the trench on April 3rd. I don't mean to interfere with a man's business, but I have to ask what exactly you think you're accomplishing here. Cornelius paused in his digging, leaned on his shovel, and wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that had once been white. I am building a fire break, he said, his English careful and accented but perfectly clear. A water-filled fire break that will protect my home and my sons and my livestock when the fires come. Halloran was quiet for a moment, processing this. When the fires come, he repeated. You've been here, what, a year and a half? And you're already certain the fires are coming. I have been here long enough to see the fuel, Cornelius said, and I have seen fire in my own country. I know what it does. I know what stops it. Water stops it, Halloran agreed. But son, you're talking about filling a ditch that's, what, half a mile around? With water you don't have. The creek on your property runs maybe 6 months out of the year, and even then it's not much more than a trickle by August. Where exactly do you plan to get the water to fill this moat of yours? This was the question Cornelius had anticipated, the question that revealed the fundamental difference between those who thought about water as a resource to be used and those who understood it as a system to be managed. I will not fill it from the creek, he explained. I will fill it from the rain. He walked Halloran along the edge of the excavation to a point where the trench intersected with a natural drainage swale that ran down from the hillside above his property. Here, the design became more complex. Cornelius had engineered a series of check dams and settling pools that would capture runoff during the winter rains and direct it into the main channel. The slope of the channel itself was calculated at a grade of 0.15%, just enough to allow water to circulate and prevent stagnation, but not so much that the water would drain away. At the lowest point of the perimeter, he had designed an overflow weir that would release excess water into a natural drainage rather than allowing the channel to breach its banks. The system was, in essence, a closed loop that would capture winter rainfall, store it through the dry season, and maintain a continuous water barrier around his property from approximately December through October. The evaporation rate in this climate, he had calculated, was roughly 0.2 inches per day during the hottest months. His channel, with its 5-foot depth and relatively narrow surface width, would lose approximately 4,400 gallons per day to evaporation at peak summer. But the total volume of the completed channel would be approximately 660,000 gallons, meaning he could sustain the water level through a 6-month dry season even without additional rainfall, provided he started the season with the channel full, and he intended to start every season with the channel full. Halloran listened to this explanation with the expression of a man who was hearing something technically coherent but fundamentally misguided. That's a lot of calculating for a ditch, he said finally. And even if your numbers are right, and I'm not saying they're not, you're putting an awful lot of work into solving a problem that might never arrive. We've had fires out here, sure, but nothing that couldn't be handled with a good fire break and some wet burlap. You're building fortifications against an enemy that might show up once every 20 years. Cornelius nodded slowly, acknowledging the point. In my country, he said, we have a saying, God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. We did this not because the sea attacked every year. Some years the storms were mild, some years the dikes held without effort. But we built them strong enough for the worst storm, not the average storm, because the average storm does not kill your children. Halloran had no response to this. He mounted his horse, wished Cornelius luck with his project, in a tone that suggested he thought luck was exactly what would be required, and rode back to his own property. That evening, he told his wife Margaret that the new Dutchman was either the most cautious man he'd ever met or the most foolish, and that only time would tell which. The excavation continued through April and into May, and as the channel took shape, more neighbors came to observe and to offer their opinions. Thomas Whitfield, who owned the property to the east and had served 2 terms on the County Board of Supervisors, expressed concern that the moat would create a mosquito breeding ground that would plague the entire valley. Cornelius explained that the gentle circulation of the water, combined with the introduction of mosquito fish that he planned to stock from a pond in Sacramento, would prevent stagnation and keep insect populations controlled. Whitfield was skeptical, but acknowledged that the Dutchman seemed to have thought the matter through. Sarah Chen, the widow who operated a small orchard on the south-facing slope below Cornelius's property, worried that the excavation would somehow affect the groundwater she depended on for her irrigation. Cornelius walked her through the hydrology, showing her that his channel was capturing surface runoff that would otherwise flow into the creek and eventually out of the valley entirely. If anything, he argued, the water he retained in his channel would percolate slowly into the groundwater table and improve conditions for everyone downstream. Mrs. Chen was not entirely convinced, but she appreciated that he had taken her concerns seriously rather than dismissing them. The most vocal skeptic, however, was James Murdoch, a 48-year-old farmer who had lost his first homestead in Nebraska to a prairie fire in 1881 and had specifically chosen the California foothills because he believed the terrain provided natural fire breaks that the flat Nebraska prairie did not. Murdoch knew fire. He had watched it consume everything he owned in the space of 3 hours, and he had rebuilt his life on the principle that understanding fire meant understanding how to stay out of its path. "You can't fight fire with water," Murdoch told Cornelius on May 17th, standing at the edge of the now half-completed channel. "Not out here, not in these conditions. When a fire comes through this country, it comes with wind, and the wind carries embers a quarter-mile ahead of the flame front. Your moat might stop the ground fire, but it won't stop an ember landing on your roof. And once your roof catches, all that water sitting in your ditch won't do you a bit of good." Cornelius listened carefully to this objection because it was the first one that addressed a genuine vulnerability in his design. "You are correct," he said. "The ember cast is the danger. This is why the moat is not my only preparation." He led Murdoch up the slope to his cabin, which was now surrounded by a cleared zone extending 100 feet in every direction. Within this zone, Cornelius had removed all brush, trimmed the lower branches of the remaining oaks to a height of 8 feet, and covered the ground with a layer of gravel 3 inches deep that he had hauled from the creek bed. The cabin roof, which the previous owner had covered with wooden shingles, was in the process of being replaced with ceramic tiles that Cornelius had ordered from a manufacturer in San Francisco, an expense of $127 that his neighbors considered extravagant, bordering on insane. The walls of the cabin he had coated with a lime wash that his grandfather had taught him to make, a mixture that would not stop fire, but would resist it longer than raw wood. And at each corner of the cabin, he had installed rain barrels connected to the gutter system, providing 880 gallons of water that could be accessed from any side of the structure. "When the fire comes," Cornelius said, "I will not run. I will wet down the roof and walls from these barrels while my sons patrol the perimeter with buckets from the moat. The gravel will not burn. The cleared zone will slow the flame front. The moat will stop the ground fire from approaching the structure. And if embers land on the tiles, they will not find fuel." Murdoch examined the preparations with the practiced eye of a man who had seen what fire could do. "That's a lot of ifs," he said finally. "And I've seen fires that made a mockery of every preparation anyone ever made. But I'll say this for you, Dutchman, you're thorough." He extended his hand, and Cornelius shook it. They were not friends exactly, but they had reached an understanding. Murdoch thought Cornelius was probably wasting his effort, but he respected the systematic thinking behind the waste. The channel was completed on August 2nd, 1889, after 112 days of labor, longer than Cornelius had estimated, due to unexpected rock formations that required blasting and a 2-week delay when Peter broke his ankle falling from a horse. The final dimensions exceeded his original specifications slightly. The channel averaged 8.5 feet wide at the top and 4.2 feet at the bottom, with a depth that varied between 4.8 and 5.3 feet, depending on the underlying terrain. The total excavated volume was approximately 31,400 cubic feet, and the channel held approximately 704,000 gallons when filled to within 6 inches of the top. The cost of the project, in addition to Cornelius's labor and that of his sons, included $23 for blasting powder, $14 for the rental of a horse-drawn scraper from a neighbor, $8 for the lumber used in the check dams and overflow weir, and $127 for the ceramic roof tiles. Total cash expenditure, $172, in an era when the average farm family in El Dorado County earned approximately $400 per year. The neighbors had stopped coming to observe by July. The novelty had worn off, and most had concluded that the Dutchman's Moat was simply an expensive eccentricity that would provide good fodder for stories told to visitors from back east. He dug a moat around his property, they would say, emphasizing the word with amusement. Like a castle, filled it with water and fish, convinced himself he's going to stop a wildfire with a ditch. The laughter was gentle for the most part. Cornelius was well-liked despite his strange project. He worked hard, paid his debts promptly, attended church regularly if quietly, and had raised 2 sons who were polite and industrious. If he wanted to spend his money on a moat, well, that was his business. America was built on the principle that a man could spend his money on whatever foolishness appealed to him. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was generous. Rainfall in the Sierra foothills totaled 34.7 inches between October and April, well above the historical average of 28 inches. By February, Cornelius's channel was full. The check dams had performed exactly as designed, and the overflow weir had released approximately 180,000 gallons of excess water into the natural drainage without any breach of the channel banks. The mosquito fish he had introduced were thriving, and no unusual insect problems were reported by any of the neighboring properties. Thomas Whitfield grudgingly admitted that the mosquito concern had apparently been addressed. The summer of 1890 was warm but not exceptional. Temperatures reached 98 degrees on the hottest days, fire danger was elevated through August and September, and several small blazes burned in the surrounding hills, but none approached the settled valley, where Cornelius and his neighbors had established their claims. The channel lost approximately 38 inches of depth to evaporation over the course of the dry season, leaving about 18 inches of water by October. Less than Cornelius had hoped, but enough to demonstrate that the basic concept was viable. He made a note to experiment with floating covers for the following summer, perhaps oil-soaked canvas sheets that would reduce evaporation while still allowing access to the water in an emergency. If you find value in these stories of practical wisdom and the careful application of principle to problem, I would ask you to consider subscribing to this channel. The history of innovation is filled with people whose preparations were mocked until the crisis arrived, and these stories deserve to be preserved and shared. The winter of 1890 to 1891 was drier than the previous year, only 22.3 inches of rainfall, but still sufficient to refill the channel completely by March. The summer of 1891 was hotter, with 14 days above 100 degrees between June and September, and the fire danger was correspondingly elevated. Again, small fires burned in the surrounding hills. Again, none reached the settled valley. The neighbors stopped commenting on the moat entirely. It had become simply part of the landscape, an accepted quirk of the Vanderburg property that warranted no more attention than any other fence line or outbuilding. Cornelius continued to maintain the system, clearing debris from the check dams each winter, restocking the mosquito fish as needed, and making incremental improvements to the water circulation during the dry season. His sons, now 18 and 16, had absorbed their father's philosophy completely. Henrik could calculate evaporation rates and runoff capture volumes as easily as any university-trained engineer, and Peter had developed a particular expertise in the construction and maintenance of the ceramic tile roof that his father had pioneered. The drought began in the winter of 1891 to 1892, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Rainfall that season totaled only 16.8 inches, the lowest in recorded history for El Dorado County. The channel refilled to approximately 70% of capacity, which Cornelius considered adequate but not ideal. He implemented the floating canvas covers he had been experimenting with, reducing evaporation loss by approximately 30%, and he accepted that he would need to be more vigilant about water conservation if the pattern continued. The following winter was worse. Rainfall from October 1892 through April 1893 totaled just 11.4 inches, less than half the historical average. The streams that normally ran through the foothills dwindled to trickles and then dried up entirely. Wells that had never failed began producing muddy water, and then no water at all. The grasslands that supported the cattle ranchers turned brown by May, 2 months earlier than normal, and the ranchers began selling off livestock at prices that barely covered the cost of transport to market. The channel, despite Cornelius's conservation measures, held only 40% of its designed capacity by June, approximately 280,000 gallons, or about 28 inches of depth. Enough to serve as a fire break, he calculated, but barely. The margins were thin. Everything that summer had thin margins. The fire danger assessment published by the county in early July of 1893 used language that had never appeared in previous reports. Extreme, the assessment stated. Conditions unprecedented in the recorded history of this region. All burning permits were suspended. Citizens were advised to maintain a 200-foot clearance around their structures, a recommendation that drew bitter laughter from settlers who had not maintained so much as a 20-foot clearance and had no intention of starting now. The meadows and hillsides were covered with dry grass that crackled underfoot, and the chaparral was so desiccated that leaves crumbled to dust when touched. Robert Halloran, who had skeptically observed Cornelius's excavation 4 years earlier, found himself reconsidering his initial assessment. He rode over to the Van der Berg property on July 19th and spent an hour walking the perimeter of the channel, noting the water level, the condition of the banks, and the cleared zone around the cabin. "I owe you an apology," Halloran said when he had completed his inspection. "I thought you were preparing for something that would never come. Now I'm thinking you might have been the only one of us who was thinking clearly." Cornelius shook his head. "You were not wrong to question. The questioning is how we all learn. But the fire will come, Mr. Halloran. Not maybe. It will come. The mathematics of this situation allow no other conclusion. The fuel is there. The drought has made it ready. The only question is when and where the spark arrives. And when it comes, you believe this will save you?" "I believe it gives me a chance," Cornelius said. "That is all any preparation can do. Give you a chance that those who did not prepare will not have." Halloran was silent for a long moment, looking at the channel, at the cleared zone, at the ceramic tile roof that gleamed in the brutal July sun. Then he asked a question that Cornelius had not anticipated. "Is it too late to do something similar for my own place?" The answer, Cornelius knew, was almost certainly yes. The excavation alone had taken nearly 4 months, with 3 men working steadily, and the channel was only useful if it contained water, which required a winter's worth of rainfall to accumulate. The summer was half over. The fire season was already upon them. There was no time to dig a protective channel, and no water to fill it, even if the digging could be completed. But Cornelius also knew that doing something, even something inadequate, was better than doing nothing. "We cannot dig a channel," he said, "but we can clear fuel. Bring your sons, bring your neighbors, and we will clear a zone around your cabin. Not as good as what I have here, but better than nothing. And if the fire comes, you come here. The moat is wide enough for many people, not just my family." The fire that would become known as the Coloma Complex started on August 23, 1893, at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, when a spark from a passing locomotive ignited dry grass along the railroad right-of-way 6 miles northeast of the settled valley. The temperature at the time of ignition was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The relative humidity was 8%. The wind was blowing from the northeast at 15 miles per hour with gusts to 25. These were the conditions that fire scientists in later decades would learn to identify as the signature of catastrophic fire behavior, the conditions under which fires did not merely burn, but exploded across the landscape with a speed and intensity that defied comprehension. The fire covered the first mile in approximately 20 minutes, consuming everything in its path: dry grass, chaparral, isolated stands of oak, abandoned mining structures from the gold rush era, and the homestead of a miner named Patrick Sullivan, who had lived alone in a one-room cabin and whose remains would not be found for 3 weeks. By 3 p.m., the smoke column was visible from the settled valley, a towering plume that rose thousands of feet into the sky before flattening and spreading to the southwest. The residents watched with the mixture of fascination and dread that frontier people developed toward forces beyond their control. Some began packing valuables into wagons, preparing to flee. Others wetted down their roofs with whatever water they had available and trusted that the fire would burn itself out before reaching them. Cornelius van der Berg did neither. He had been preparing for this moment for 4.5 years, and now that it had arrived, he executed the plan he had rehearsed with his sons more than 50 times. Henrik took responsibility for the north and east perimeters, positioning himself with 2 buckets and a rope system that allowed him to draw water from the channel without entering it. Peter took the south and west perimeters with the same equipment and the same training. Cornelius himself climbed to the roof of the cabin, where he had staged the rain barrels worth of water in position, and established a system of wetted burlap sheets that could be quickly deployed to smother any ember that landed on the tiles. The three of them watched the smoke column grow, watched the orange glow appear on the ridge to the northeast, watched the sun turn red, and then nearly disappear behind the thickening pall. By 5 p.m., the fire had covered 4 miles. By 7 p.m., it had covered 6 miles and was less than a mile from the first homesteads in the settled valley. The wind, which had been steady all afternoon, began to gust erratically as the fire created its own weather patterns, drawing air in from all directions to feed the insatiable demand for oxygen at the combustion front. Cornelius had read about this phenomenon in European fire science literature, but reading about it was nothing compared to experiencing it. The wind shifted direction 3 times in 10 minutes, each shift accompanied by a new surge of smoke and an ominous increase in the roaring sound that had become the fire's voice. At 7:43 p.m., the fire reached the first homestead in the settled valley. It was the property of a family named Richardson, who had moved to California from Ohio just 2 years earlier and had not yet fully understood the fire danger that came with their new home. They had maintained no clearance around their cabin, had not wetted their roof, had not prepared any firefighting equipment. When the fire reached their property line, they were still loading their wagon, still believing they had time to escape. They did not have time. The fire moved through the dry grass at approximately 250 feet per minute, faster than a person could run over rough terrain, faster than a heavily loaded wagon could travel on an unpaved road. The Richardson family abandoned their wagon and fled on foot, escaping with their lives but losing everything they owned except the clothes they wore. Their cabin, their barn, their livestock, their stored harvest from the previous year, all of it consumed in less than 15 minutes. The fire moved on. The flames reached the Halloran property at 8:17 p.m., traveling along the same ridge that Cornelius had been watching when he first began planning his moat 4.5 years earlier. Halloran had taken Cornelius's advice and organized a fuel clearing party in the weeks following their conversation, removing brush and dry grass from a zone approximately 75 feet around his cabin. It was less than half what Cornelius had recommended, less than a quarter of the distance that modern fire science would later establish as the minimum for effective defensible space, but it was more than any of the other properties in the valley had done. The clearing slowed the fire. It did not stop it. The ember cast that James Murdoch had warned about proved to be exactly as dangerous as he had predicted. Burning fragments carried by the erratic winds landed on Halloran's wooden roof, on his fence posts, on the dry grass beyond his cleared perimeter. Halloran and his 2 grown sons worked frantically with buckets of water hauled from their nearly dry well, extinguishing 1 spot fire, only to see 2 more ignite behind them. At 8:31 p.m., the roof of their barn caught fire from an ember landing in accumulated debris in the gutter system that Halloran had never thought to clean. The barn was fully engulfed within 4 minutes. At 8:44 p.m., an ember landed on the Halloran cabin's roof and found the gap between 2 shingles where the wood had dried and shrunk during the drought years. The fire established itself in the roof structure, spread through the attic, and descended into the living space faster than the exhausted family could respond. By 9:00 p.m., Robert Halloran, his wife Margaret, his sons William and Thomas, and his daughter-in-law Mary stood in the cleared zone watching their home of 15 years burn to the ground. They had saved the horses, 2 milk cows, a trunk of family documents, and nothing else. Halloran remembered, in that moment, what Cornelius had said. "If the fire comes, you come here. The moat is wide enough for many people." He gathered his family, mounted what horses could carry riders, loaded the elderly and the documents onto the remaining cow, and began moving toward the Vanderburg property. They were not the only ones. Throughout the settled valley, families whose preparations had proven inadequate were making the same calculation, remembering the strange Dutchman with his expensive moat and his ceramic tile roof and his cleared zone that had seemed so excessive and now seemed like prophecy. By 9:30 p.m., 17 people had gathered on the Vanderburg property, crowding onto the narrow strip of gravel between the cabin and the water-filled channel. The fire was everywhere now, on 3 sides at once, the flames visible through gaps in the smoke, the heat palpable even at a distance of 300 feet. The temperature inside the fire perimeter, measured later by researchers analyzing the burn patterns, exceeded 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit in the most intense areas. The temperature at the edge of Cornelius's cleared zone never exceeded 180 degrees. The difference was the moat. If you have learned something from these accounts of preparation meeting crisis, I would be grateful if you would share this channel with others who value such knowledge. The practical wisdom of our predecessors is at risk of being lost, and every share helps ensure it reaches those who can benefit. The fire approached from the northeast first, racing down the same ridge where Cornelius had stood with Halloran just weeks earlier. It hit the edge of the moat at 9:47 p.m., and the physics that Cornelius had calculated from his grandfather's teachings proved themselves exactly as predicted. The water-filled channel was 8.5 feet wide at this point, with approximately 26 inches of water, despite the drought-diminished level. The fire could not cross it. The flames reached the edge, encountered no fuel, and were forced to move laterally along the channel rather than continuing toward the cabin. The ground fire died at the water's edge, but the embers did not die. They rose on the convective columns that the fire generated, they caught the erratic winds, and they fell like burning snow on everything inside the perimeter. At 9:52 p.m., an ember landed on the ceramic tile roof of the Vanderberg cabin. It bounced once, rolled into the gutter, and extinguished itself in the half-inch of water that Cornelius had left there specifically for this purpose. At 9:56 p.m., a larger ember landed on the gravel-covered ground 12 feet from where Margaret Halloran stood clutching her family Bible. The ember smoldered for approximately 15 seconds and then went out, finding no fuel to sustain it. At 10:03 p.m., a burning branch approximately 18 inches long landed on the wooden cover of the rain barrel nearest the east corner of the cabin. Peter Vanderberg saw it within 2 seconds, crossed the distance in 4 strides, knocked the branch to the gravel with a wetted burlap sack, and stamped it out. The barrel cover was charred, but not breached. The water remained accessible. The peak intensity of the fire's assault on the Vanderberg perimeter occurred between 10:15 and 10:45 p.m., a 30-minute period during which the embercast was nearly continuous, and the heat from the fire burning just beyond the moat raised the temperature inside the cleared zone to approximately 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The 17 refugees huddled together in the center of the gravel area, wrapped in wetted blankets that Cornelius had distributed from a stockpile he maintained specifically for this purpose. Henrik Vanderberg patrolled his assigned perimeter without pause, extinguishing 7 separate spot fires where embers had found the few remaining combustible materials within reach. A forgotten wooden bucket, a patch of dry leaves that had blown in despite the gravel cover, the corner of a burlap sack that had not been properly wetted. Peter handled 4 more on his perimeter. Cornelius, from his position on the roof, used the entire contents of 2 rain barrels to keep the tiles and walls wetted, constantly scanning for any ember that might find purchase. At 10:38 p.m., the wind shifted dramatically, veering from northeast to northwest in the space of approximately 90 seconds. The fire, which had been pressing against the northeast section of the moat, suddenly redirected its assault to the northwest. This was the section where the terrain sloped most steeply down to the channel, and where Cornelius had compensated for the slope by making the channel slightly wider, 9 feet at the top rather than the standard 8.5. The wider channel had reduced the water depth at this point to only 22 inches even before the drought, and the current drought had reduced it further to perhaps 16 inches. It was the weakest point in the perimeter, and the fire found it as if by instinct. For 11 minutes, from 10:41 to 10:52 p.m., the fire concentrated its fury on the northwest section. The heat was intense enough to begin evaporating water from the channel itself, sending steam rising into the smoke-filled air. The flames at the channel's edge were tall enough to lap over the water and briefly touch the gravel on the inside bank. 2 embers, the size of a man's fist, landed within feet of the cabin's northwest corner, and only Peter's immediate response, he was there before the embers had finished bouncing, smothering them with wetted burlap, prevented them from finding the vulnerable junction where the gravel met the lime-washed cabin wall. At 10:52 p.m., the wind shifted again, this time to the south, and the fire's attention moved elsewhere. The pressure on the northwest perimeter eased. The steam stopped rising from the channel. The temperature inside the cleared zone began to drop, slowly at first, then more rapidly, as the fire consumed the last of the available fuel on the surrounding hillsides and began to starve. By 11:30 p.m., the immediate danger had passed. The fire continued to burn in the distance, visible as orange glows on multiple horizons, but the fuel around the Vanderberg property was exhausted. The moat was intact, though the water level had dropped approximately 4 inches from evaporation and the steam losses during the northwest assault. The cabin was intact, though the lime wash on the northwest wall was discolored from the heat and would need to be reapplied. The ceramic tile roof showed no damage whatsoever. Every ember that had landed on it had either bounced off or self-extinguished. The gravel was scorched in places, marked with black circles where embers had burned themselves out, but it was otherwise unaffected. The cleared zone had performed exactly as designed. It had provided no fuel for the fire, no ladder for the flames to climb from ground level to structure. The 17 refugees were unharmed. Every horse and cow that had made it inside the perimeter had survived. The temperature never rose high enough to cause heat injury to any person or animal. In the 4.5 hours between the fire's first approach and its final retreat, not a single structure or life under Cornelius Vanderberg's protection had been lost. In the rest of the settled valley, the losses were catastrophic. The survey conducted by the county in the weeks following the fire documented the full extent of the destruction. 14 homesteads had been completely destroyed, their structures reduced to ash, and their livestock killed or scattered. 8 additional homesteads had suffered significant damage, losing barns, outbuildings, fencing, and stored crops, even if the main residents had survived. 3 people had died: Patrick Sullivan, the solitary miner whose remains were found on August 27th, Elizabeth Morrison, a 73-year-old woman who had refused to leave her home and whose body was found in the ruins of her cabin, and an infant named Thomas Garrett, who had died of smoke inhalation while his parents fled on foot through the burning landscape. The total property loss was estimated at $47,000, an enormous sum for a rural community in 1893. The emotional losses, the family photographs, the letters from loved ones back east, the handmade quilts and heirloom furniture that had traveled across the continent, could not be quantified. The Vanderberg property represented the only complete success story in the entire valley. It was also the only property that had been prepared according to the principles that Cornelius had learned from his grandfather in Zealand and adapted to the California landscape over 4.5 years of methodical work. The correlation was impossible to ignore, even for those who had spent years dismissing the Dutchman's preparations as excessive. James Murdoch was the first to visit after the fire, arriving on August 28th, while Cornelius was still helping the Halloran family construct a temporary shelter on their burned-out property. Murdoch walked the perimeter of the moat, examined the scorched but unburned gravel, looked up at the undamaged ceramic tile roof, and stood for a long time at the northwest section, where the assault had been most intense. The scorch marks on the inside bank of the channel were visible, as was the line on the channel wall showing where the water level had dropped during the steam event. "I said your moat wouldn't stop the embers," Murdoch said when Cornelius returned. "I was right about that. The embers came. They landed everywhere." "Yes," Cornelius agreed. "They did. But you stopped them anyway. The gravel, the cleared zone, your boys with the buckets. The moat didn't stop the embers, but it stopped everything else, and it gave you a position from which to fight what the moat couldn't stop." Cornelius nodded. That was the plan. 4.5 years ago, you told me you were building a system. I thought you were being pretentious, turning a ditch into something more than it was. But you were right. The moat by itself would not have been enough. The cleared zone by itself would not have been enough. The tile roof by itself, the wetted burlap, the trained sons, none of them alone would have been enough. But together, as a system, they were enough. I've never seen anything like it. "You have seen it now," Cornelius said. "And if you want to build something similar on your own property, I will help you." Murdoch was quiet for a moment, looking at the burned hillsides that surrounded the island of safety where they stood. "I think I would like that," he said. "I think a lot of people in this valley would like that." The year following the Coloma Complex fire saw the most extensive construction effort in the history of El Dorado County's settled communities. Cornelius Vanderberg, who had been considered an eccentric at best and a fool at worst, found himself the most sought-after advisor in the region. Every property owner who had survived the fire wanted to understand what he had done and how to replicate it. Some wanted the full system: the moat, the cleared zone, the tile roof, the training protocols. Others wanted components that fit their particular circumstances and budgets. Cornelius helped them all, adapting his principles to each specific situation rather than insisting on a one-size-fits-all approach. For Robert Halloran, who was rebuilding on the same property where his previous home had burned, Cornelius designed a modified channel system that took advantage of a natural spring on the hillside above the building site. The spring did not flow with enough volume to fill a full moat, but it could sustain a narrower channel, 5 feet wide rather than 8, that encircled the immediate house site. Combined with an aggressive clearing program that extended 150 feet in all directions and a roof design that incorporated the ceramic tile system Cornelius had pioneered, the new Halloran Homestead would be the second most fire-resistant structure in the valley. For Thomas Whitfield, who lacked access to any spring or creek and depended entirely on rainfall, Cornelius designed a cistern system that captured and stored winter runoff in an underground tank holding approximately 15,000 gallons. The cistern fed a series of strategically placed outlets around the property, allowing Whitfield to quickly wet down structures and ground cover if fire approached. It was not a moat, but it was the best adaptation possible given the constraints of the site. For James Murdoch, who had the most extensive property and the most resources to invest, Cornelius designed a comprehensive system that went beyond even what he had built for himself. Murdoch's version included a full perimeter moat, a cleared zone extending 200 feet, and an innovative network of buried pipes that could deliver water from the moat to any point within the defended area using gravity feed. The total cost of the Murdoch system was $412, an investment that most of the community considered remarkable, even as they acknowledged that it was probably worth every penny. By the summer of 1894, 17 properties in the settled valley had implemented some version of the Vanderburg fire defense principles. The techniques varied according to terrain, water availability, and financial resources, but they all shared the core concepts: create a discontinuity that ground fire cannot cross, maintain a cleared zone that denies fuel to any fire that does cross, protect structures with fire-resistant materials, and prepare the means to actively fight any embers that penetrate the outer defenses. The neighbors stopped calling it the Dutchman's Moat. They started calling it the Vanderburg system, and eventually just fire preparation or defensible space, names that conveyed the practical function rather than the individual origin. This is how knowledge spreads on the frontier. An idea that seems absurd when first proposed becomes merely controversial when its proponent explains the reasoning. It becomes interesting when partial evidence suggests it might work. It becomes respected when a crisis proves its effectiveness. And it becomes invisible, simply the way things are done, when a generation grows up never knowing it was ever otherwise. The Vanderburg system became invisible within 15 years. These accounts of ordinary people solving extraordinary problems through methodical application of principle deserve to be preserved and shared. If this narrative has provided value to you, I invite you to subscribe and to share this channel with others who appreciate practical wisdom. The stories we tell shape the knowledge we preserve. Cornelius Vanderburg died on March 3, 1911, at the age of 65, from pneumonia contracted during an unusually wet winter. His obituary in the Placerville Mountain Democrat was brief and focused primarily on his service to the Methodist Church and his success as an orchardist. The moat system that he had pioneered was not mentioned. By 1911, defensible space and water-filled fire breaks were common features of properties throughout the California foothills, and few people remembered that these practices had been innovations at all. The county fire marshal's report for 1910 recommended that all new construction maintain a minimum cleared zone of 100 feet and consider water storage systems for firefighting purposes. The report cited established local practices as the source of these recommendations, but did not identify the individual who had established them. Henrik Vanderburg took over his father's property and maintained the original moat system until his own death in 1947. By that time, the channel had been in continuous operation for 58 years, surviving 17 fire seasons of elevated danger and 3 major fires that burned through the surrounding landscape. It was never breached, The cabin his father had built, with its ceramic tile roof and lime-washed walls, stood until 1952, when Henrik's son, Marcus, demolished it to make way for a modern ranch house with fire-resistant stucco siding and a composition shingle roof that met the new county fire codes. The moat was filled in during the same construction project, deemed unnecessary given the improved roads that allowed fire trucks to reach the property in approximately 12 minutes. The ground where the channel had run became part of an expanded lawn area, and within a few years, the grass had grown thick enough that no trace of the excavation was visible. Peter Vanderberg moved to San Francisco in 1898 and became a civil engineer, eventually working on the water supply systems that served the growing city. He spent the latter part of his career consulting on urban fire prevention, drawing on the lessons he had learned at his father's side during the Coloma Complex fire. His reports to the San Francisco Fire Commission in 1905 and 1906 warned of inadequate water infrastructure and concentrated fuel loads in the city's residential areas. His warnings went unheeded. The San Francisco earthquake and fire of April 1906 killed over 3,000 people and destroyed 28,000 buildings. Peter survived, living until 1934 and never stopping his advocacy for the fire prevention principles his father had taught him. The modern practice of defensible space in fire-prone regions traces its formal origins to research conducted in the 1970s and 1980s by fire scientists studying structure survival in wildland-urban interface fires. These researchers documented what Cornelius Vanderberg had understood intuitively in 1889, that structures survive not through luck, but through systematic preparation, and that the key elements of survival are fuel discontinuity, cleared zones, fire-resistant materials, and active suppression capability. California's current defensible space regulations require property owners in high fire risk areas to maintain a minimum cleared zone of 100 feet around structures, almost exactly the distance that Cornelius had established around his cabin 130 years earlier. The regulations also encourage, though do not require, the use of fire-resistant roofing materials, the removal of accumulated debris from gutters and roof surfaces, and the development of on-site water storage for firefighting. The concept of a water-filled perimeter moat has not achieved the same widespread adoption, primarily because most modern properties lack the water resources and terrain features that made Cornelius's system feasible. However, the principle has found applications in specific contexts. Some luxury properties in high fire risk areas of California, Australia, and Southern Europe have incorporated water features that serve dual purposes as aesthetic elements and passive fire breaks. At least one development in the Santa Barbara foothills, constructed in 2017, includes a community-wide water channel system that functions essentially as a collective moat, protecting 23 homes behind a continuous water barrier fed by reclaimed wastewater. The residents who live there call it the Ring. They do not know the name Cornelius Vanderberg, and none of them have ever heard of the Coloma Complex fire of 1893. They know only that the system was designed by an engineer who knew about these things, and that it provides a measure of security that their neighbors outside the ring do not enjoy. This is the nature of practical knowledge. It survives not because it is remembered, but because it works. Every property owner who clears fuel from their defensible space, every homeowner who chooses a Class A fire-rated roof, every community that invests in water infrastructure for firefighting is building on principles that Cornelius Vanderberg articulated in a Sierra Nevada valley more than a century ago. They do not know his name. They do not need to know his name. What they need is the knowledge, and the knowledge endures because it is tested every fire season and validated every time a prepared structure survives while unprepared structures burn. The mathematics of fire preparation are brutal but clear. Fuel plus heat plus oxygen equals fire, and removing any element of that equation breaks the chain. Cornelius Vanderberg understood this equation before fire science had a name, understood it in his bones from 4 centuries of Dutch wisdom about managing elemental forces that could destroy everything you had built. He applied that understanding in a new landscape with new challenges, adapted his ancestral knowledge to conditions his grandfather had never imagined, and proved through one catastrophic night that preparation is not paranoia. It is simply mathematics. The neighbors who laughed at his moat in the spring of 1889 were not fools. They were people applying reasonable experience to an unreasonable situation, trusting that what had worked well enough in the past would work well enough in the future. They were wrong, but their error was understandable. What was not understandable, what represented genuine foolishness, was continuing to believe that experience alone was sufficient after the evidence of August 23, 1893, had demonstrated otherwise. To their credit, most of them did not continue in that belief. They learned, they adapted, they built their own systems based on the principles the Dutchmen had proven. Within a generation, fire preparation was simply what responsible property owners did in El Dorado County. The practice spread to neighboring counties, then to the broader region, then to other fire-prone areas across the West. The moat that had been mocked as a medieval affectation became the foundation of a tradition that would save countless lives and structures in the century that followed. Cornelius van der Burg never sought credit for this legacy. He never wrote a book about his methods, or gave lectures at county fairs, or petitioned the government to recognize his contribution. He simply maintained his own system, helped his neighbors build theirs, raised his sons to understand the principles, and trusted that what worked would continue to work whether or not anyone remembered who had first proven it. That trust was justified. The principles work. They work in California chaparral and Australian eucalyptus forests, in Mediterranean scrubland, and anywhere else that fire is a predictable danger. They work because they are not opinions or traditions, but descriptions of physical reality, how fire behaves, what it needs to burn, what stops it from burning. Good ideas do not need recognition to be valuable, and the value of Cornelius van der Burg's idea has been proven 10,000 times in fires that did not destroy the structures they approached because those structures were prepared. The neighbors stopped laughing in August of 1893, but, in a sense, the laughter had never mattered. What mattered was the mathematics, and the mathematics were clear from the beginning. The moat that surrounded his cabin looked strange to people who had never seen a structure survive a major wildfire. But it kept his firewood dry, his family safe, and his neighbors alive through the worst fire California's El Dorado County had ever seen. And when the skeptics asked him, in the days after the fire, how he had known what to do, Cornelius van der Burg gave the same answer he had given to Robert Halloran 4 years earlier. He had seen the fuel. He knew what fire could do. He knew what stopped it. That was not pride talking, and it was not luck. That was just mathematics, and mathematics do not care about tradition. They care about what works.